Committee will come to order. Cyber is deeply ingrained in virtually every facet of our daily lives, at work, at home, in our schools, and in government. We are incredibly dependent upon it, and therefore we are incredibly vulnerable to disruptions or attacks that affect it. Cyber threats, cyber is a great enabler for our daily lives, but the threats also pose a significant danger to our national security as well. What adds complication is that various estimates show 85% of the infrastructure that needs to be protected is owned by the private sector. And so the role of government in protecting not only itself, but the country in this new domain of warfare is a major challenge for us. So that's part of the reason this committee is devoting a week to cybersecurity issues. We are starting today with an outstanding panel of experts to help not only share their insights, but set up the discussion for the remainder of the week. Tomorrow we'll have the Deputy Secretary of Defense and the Commander of Cybercom before us. The Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee has a classified briefing on cyber later in the week. Cyber, of course, is normally in ETC's jurisdiction, but because it does translate to all aspects of this committee's work, and because of these overall policy issues, the full committee is having these hearings today and tomorrow. As I say, there's a number of questions. What's the role of the federal government in defending that 85% of the infrastructure? How do you have deterrence in cyberspace? Do we have the necessary authorities and rules of engagement to engage in cyber warfare? Are we acquiring the people and the capabilities that we need? Do we have a strategy that can deal with what some of our adversaries are doing? What effect do things like the agreement that the Chinese and the President have reached this week have on cyber? Just some of the questions for us to explore. So I really appreciate, to start off our Cyber Week, having this outstanding panel of experts. Before we turn to them, I'm going to yield to the distinguished ranking member of the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee, Mr. Langevin, for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing before us today on the Department of Defense new cyber strategy released in April 2015. I certainly look forward to hearing what you have to say. Ranking Member Smith is going to be joining us a little later today, so I'll be delivering a synopsis of his remarks on his behalf. So I look forward to hearing the witnesses' perspective on the 5 strategic goals, their views on the objectives outlined in the strategy in order to achieve those goals, and what else we should be thinking about to improve the posture of the Department of Defense in the cyber domain. Cybersecurity is an issue that the Chairman, the Ranking Member, and I have been focusing on throughout our tenure on the Armed Services Committee. Our time on the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee has given us all insight into what has been recognized since 2013 by the Director of National Intelligence as the #1 strategic threat to national security. We've worked in coordination with the Department of Defense across the whole of government and with the private sector for many years to better enable the country to deter, defend, and respond to cyber attacks. Despite best intentions, as a nation, we are not keeping pace, though, with the sophisticated and ever-evolving cyber threat. The DoD has made progress, but as Admiral Mike Rogers noted in his June 2015 vision and guidance for the U.S. Cyber Command, and I quote, "The Department is still in the very early stages of harnessing the power of our nation's cyber enterprise." I believe the new cyber strategy will better guide the Department in its efforts to harness the cyber enterprise. The 5 strategic goals: building and maintaining ready forces and capabilities, defending the network, securing data, and mitigating risks to missions, being prepared to defend the homeland and U.S. Vital interests from cyber attacks of significant consequence, building and maintaining vulnerable cyber operations, viable cyber operations, and plan to use those options to control conflict escalation, and shape the conflict environment, and building international alliances and partnerships to deter and increase stability, set the stage for the U.S. to gain an advantage across the cyber domain. An advantage we desperately need, as evidenced by the recent hack of the Joint Staff Unclassified Network. Yet not all of these goals and objectives are necessarily new concepts. Many are significant issues the Congress and the Department have discussed for years, yet execution of the objectives as presented, technological policy, and doctrinal challenges at the tactical, operation, and strategic levels. The new strategy provides us an opportunity to confront and address those challenges so our goals can become reality sooner rather than later. For instance, we know the Department needs qualified military and civilian personnel in order to build and maintain forces to conduct cyber operations. But how does the Department compete with the private sector for highly skilled individuals, especially in a budget-constrained environment? This committee has also been hearing about the necessity for an effective cyber deterrent strategy for several years. Time has shown the need for such an effective policy has only grown, but we're still grappling with how to approach deterrence given the difficulty of attributing attacks and the overall strategic implications of such a policy. So deterrence requires us to relook at the way we tend to think about warfare, about what constitutes an act of war. I look forward to the witnesses' views on this issue, as well as how we can operationalize other aspects of cyber. These are just a few of the issues that I hope that we'll examine today. Chairman Thornberry, I want to thank you for holding this hearing. I know of your commitment and interest in cyber issues. The work that we've done together, both on the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee and our many years together on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, have given us particular insights into the challenges in this space. And again, I appreciate the attention that the full committee is giving to this issue this week. With that, I thank the Chairman and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. He's exactly right. He and I have grappled with this issue for a number of years, and I very much appreciate Chairman Wilson and the gentleman from Rhode Island in their efforts to pursue this at the subcommittee level, and certainly the full committee is not and cannot replace that diligence that they bring to this important issue. Let me again welcome our witnesses. We have Mr. Richard Baitlick, Chief Security Strategist for FireEye, Mr. Ian Wallace, Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Cybersecurity Initiative at the New America Foundation, Mr. Dominic Delfino, Vice President at VMware, and Dr. Laura Schmidt at the RAND Corporation. I appreciate the written testimony that each of you have submitted. I've read it, and I'll ask unanimous consent to have that included in the record without objection. And so we'll, if you would, please summarize your testimony before us, and then we'll turn to questions. Mr. Baitlick, if you'd like to begin.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I am Richard Baitlick, Chief Security Strategist at FireEye. I'm also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and I'm pursuing a PhD in war studies from King's College London. I began my security career as a military intelligence officer in 1997 at the Air Force Information Warfare Center. Speaking today as FireEye strategist and as a former military officer, I assess the new DoD cyber strategy as a transition document. Previous strategies emphasized DoD's role as protecting DoD networks from attack. The current document restates this role and adds a new, albeit limited, mission: quote, defend the U.S. homeland and vital interests from disruptive or destructive cyber attacks of significant consequence. Stepping outside the Beltway for a moment, it might be natural to ask, what about OPM? Or even what about Sony? For these reasons, I believe DoD's strategy is a step in the right direction, but one that needs to be augmented by additional measures. Now, at this point in my written remarks, I cover 4 associated topics: private sector security capabilities, attribution, hackback, and acquisition. But in order to meet my time limit, I respectfully refer you to those written documents. And here I would like to turn straight to 5 recommendations to improve the nation's digital security. First, I recommend that DoD and the intelligence community modify the nature of offensive digital operations against national adversaries. According to open source intelligence tradecraft and stories published in open media, U.S. government offensive digital activities currently focus on traditional espionage targets. These operations fulfill collection requirements such that U.S. government decision makers can execute their duties based on accurate and actionable intelligence. Foreign intelligence services also conduct these operations. However, foreign intelligence services, military units, and other teams also attack private sector companies in this country and elsewhere. They also attack civil society organizations and even individuals. U.S. offensive digital capabilities should therefore be ordered to directly target the foreign teams that are attacking private U.S. entities. By putting pressure on these foreign teams, U.S. victims would receive some relief from the relentless waves of foreign hacking campaigns. By pressure, I mean low-level activities that introduce friction and uncertainty into the minds and processes of foreign hackers. For example, U.S. offensive teams could quietly corrupt tools and infrastructure used by foreign teams against domestic targets. They could periodically crash foreign computers used to hack U.S. targets or degrade bandwidth used to transport malicious traffic. The idea is to introduce obstacles into foreign hacking operations such that they are working uphill when trying to attack U.S. victims. Second, the DoD, the IC, and partners should consider indirect ways to help protect U.S. private sector and associated targets. If government actors learn that private entities are being targeted by a foreign adversary, they should be more willing to warn of the attack before it happens. Our current strategy is essentially we tell the victim after they've been hacked, which that is valuable. Many times that's the only way a victim learns, but we need to know earlier in the process. Third, I recommend that the Congress and DoD should sponsor a study into creating an independent cyber force. As a former captain who performed the computer network defense mission in the Air Force, I'm very pleased to see the existing military services improving the career paths and opportunities for today's troops. For example, I spoke at an Army Cyber Institute event last week, and I watched two young Army captains explain how they would apply cyber tactics to a simulated physical combat mission. Unfortunately, I was reminded of the challenges facing these young officers when an audience member warned that the pair's non-cyber colleagues might, quote, think they were playing warrior and that their makeshift technical solutions might appear to be a toy. These cultural barriers are real and inherent in each military service's ethos. Fourth, and this is stepping outside DoD a little bit, but it affects the entire government, I recommend that the President appoint a U.S. Chief Information Security Officer, or U.S. CISO. The executive branch already has a U.S. Chief Information Officer and a Chief Technology Officer. This is similar to the situation of many private sector businesses before a breach, but after a breach, they quickly change. Thus far, the government has not changed. We still don't have a U.S. CISO. And I would put that person at the level of current U.S. CISO and U.S. CO personnel. Finally, I recommend the administration should develop the capability to take asymmetric actions that target adversary core interests, but in a way that leverages our strengths against their weaknesses. In my written statement, I discuss one example involving China's Great Firewall. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Wallace?
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify about the Department of Defense's strategy for cyberspace. I am Ian Wallace. I'm a fellow in the International Security Program at New America, and I'm the co-director of New America's Cybersecurity Initiative. As I set out in my written testimony, the DoD's strategy is a necessary and welcome update to the 2011 Strategy for Operating in Cyberspace. And as such, I think it does a good job of identifying and describing the actions that will be necessary for the DoD to meet the challenges it faces today. And it also, I have to say, shows an admirable new level of transparency in the way that the DoD discusses these issues. But no strategy is perfect. And in my written testimony, I offer two particular ways in which I think the committee can usefully help the DoD improve on the strategy. The first of these will be to ensure that the DoD does not fall into the trap of becoming the default choice for responding to threats against the nation's civil infrastructure. The second will be to ensure that despite the undoubted cyber threats that the United States faces today, the DoD is also properly thinking about the future operating environment in which US forces will fight. Both these points are important. But while the immediacy of the current threats are alarming, and the issues like deterrence and attribution undoubtedly deserve further discussion, I encourage members not to lose sight of my second point. To understand the importance of thinking ahead about the implications of new technology, let me for a moment offer the analogy of the advent of military aviation. My own country, Britain, emerged from the First World War as a leader in carrier aviation. By the beginning of the Second World War, Britain had been eclipsed by the United States, and this new capability was obviously crucial in America's prosecution of that war. There were a number of reasons for this, but they include the United States' willingness to do 4 things that are highly relevant to our current situation. Those 4 things were the willingness to engage in operational experimentation, a willingness to actively foster new thinking about operational concepts in the top military educational establishments, a willingness to make big organizational changes based on those new concepts, and perhaps most importantly, a willingness to encourage the best and brightest, that includes the likes of Halsey, Nimitz, and King, to make this new technology central to their careers. History does not repeat itself exactly. In the 21st century, the DoD's response to new cyber capabilities will need to be much more joint than the approach taken in the 1920s and 30s. But now, as then, long-sighted action and the support, even active pushing of Congress, will be crucial to maintaining the United States military edge in future military operations. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Delfino.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the Department of Defense's cyber strategy. I am Dominic Delfino, Vice President of Worldwide Network and Security Systems Engineering at VMware. I ask that my full statement be submitted for the record. We believe that the DoD cyber strategy is a good first step towards improving the department's cyber posture. However, as with any strategy, the complexity is in the execution of the implementation. With respect to goal number 1, building cyber-ready forces and capabilities, VMware believes that this challenge can be managed with industry-proven practices, such as using technology that's available today to mimic currently evolving threats. Once in place, these cyber classrooms can provide on-demand training to warfighters globally. We also recommend the DoD leverage automation technologies to simplify cyber detection. By automating responses that can be just as rapidly be undone, the department can empower today's network professionals with the ability to stop threats immediately without having to wait for complex systems changes. For recruiting experienced personnel, the department should consider using programs like the government's Special Hiring Authority that's used to pay higher wages for people who have specialized skills. We also recommend creating a clear promotion path to command-level responsibility for cyber warriors. For goal number 2 of the cyber strategy, defending the DoD information networks, we believe a newer approach to network architecture is needed. As we've seen in the recent private sector and government attacks, hackers were able to penetrate perimeter systems and gain access to networks where they were free to access and steal sensitive data over a period of several months. Hackers typically use this attack methodology because traditional perimeter-centric security systems are structurally designed to be doors to the network. These doors serve to allow authorized users access to network systems and to prevent unauthorized users from getting inside a network. Once the intruder has penetrated perimeter security, there is no simple means to stop malicious activity within the data center without extreme disruption to the government's mission. For example, imagine a street with homes on it as an analogy for a network with servers in a data center. Let's assume there is a corridor that connects every home on the street. If an intruder can manage to break into one home, the intruder now has complete access to all of the other homes on the street, even though their doors to the street are locked, because there is a trusted passage between them. In technology terms, the larger and the flatter the network and the more servers on the network, the higher the probability the hacker will be able to penetrate one server and leverage it to compromise others on that same network. In order to prevent an attacker from moving freely within the network, the department should compartmentalize its networks, implementing what's called a zero-trust or micro-segmented environment. A zero-trust environment prevents unauthorized movement by minimizing the attack surface of the network. When a user or system breaks the rules, the potential threat incident is compartmentalized, and security staff can take any appropriate defensive actions. This limits the intruder's ability to move around freely within the network and significantly mitigates the impact of a successful perimeter breach. This approach is being widely adopted by the commercial sector, including the financial industry and some areas of the government. We applaud the department's efforts to move towards the joint information environment and believe if done correctly, it will significantly enhance the cyber posture of the DoD. We believe that the DoD should leverage the existing cloud technologies it owns and consolidate those workloads to move into the JIE first, measuring success through a scorecard. We also recommend the department review how it treats unclassified business systems. Currently, these systems such as email, personnel, and payroll are treated differently than classified mission-critical systems under current DoD practices. Finally, for goal number 3, defending the homeland from cyber attacks, we recommend 2 approaches in addressing these initiatives. The first is to automate security features. This will allow the department to proactively deploy countermeasures. The second approach is to use predictive methods to quantify attacks and likely actions based on their early stage. Investing in these capabilities will yield significant benefits by preventing later stage and more serious attacks based on the precursor activities. In summary, when implementing its cyber strategy, we believe the DoD should establish aggressive goals for automating the management of its IT infrastructure security controls. The department should also cut the common thread linking every major breach by implementing a zero-trust security model to reduce attacker and threat mobility within the network. Finally, the department should implement a scorecard to aggressively measure and manage each command's progress towards moving to the JIE. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to answering any questions the committee might have.
Thank you. Dr. Schmidt?
Thank you. Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member, and members of the committee. I'm honored to be here today to discuss this important topic. My name is Laura Schmidt, and I'm a senior researcher at the RAND Corporation. As I described in my written statement, the 2015 DoD Cyber Strategy clearly defines DoD's missions in cyberspace and, as is typical for a strategy, establishes several goals to ensure DoD is able to accomplish these missions. The goals are to build and maintain ready forces and capabilities to conduct cyber operations, to defend DoD networks, secure DoD data, and mitigate risks to DoD missions, to build and maintain viable cyber options and plan to use them in the range of conflict scenarios DoD may face, to be prepared to defend the homeland and U.S. vital interests from cyber attacks of significant consequence, and finally, to build and maintain international alliances and partnerships to deter threats and increase stability and security. The strategy also identifies a series of implementation objectives to achieve these goals. With all that said, I have 4 main points I'd like to share with you about the 2015 DoD cyber strategy. First, a capable cyber workforce is critical to achieving the goals laid out in the strategy, but the commercial sector is also vying for high-quality personnel with the same skill sets. However, DoD has an opportunity to learn from the commercial sector to attract capable military, civilian, and contractor personnel. Research into commercial hiring and retention practices shows that for most of this workforce, it does not all come down to pay, and even on that scale, DoD is not as bad off as many fear. The one exception is the market for the few personnel with elite cybersecurity skills, these so-called ninjas, who are a competitive advantage for cybersecurity and other firms, and as a result, command large salaries. My second point, despite the excitement surrounding DoD offensive and defensive cyber operations, it's important to remember that the bulk of the workforce is involved in the critical job of configuring and maintaining DoD hardware, software applications, and networks around the world. Ensuring the continued functioning of these systems and networks, even in the absence of cyber attack, is crucial. Therefore, this DoD IT workforce, or as DoD calls it, the DoDN workforce, requires continued support as well. Third, DoD has adopted a risk management approach to securing its systems across their life cycle and this is commendable. However, it's a challenging undertaking due to the scale of DoD systems and networks, the ever-changing cyber threat, and the hard choices that will need to be made to prioritize risk mitigation efforts. Adequate resources and practical approaches need to be brought to bear to effectively implement the risk management framework. Fourth, the strategy seeks to integrate cyber operations, including offensive operations, into military plans for all stages of conflict. In order to do this, the department must take a scientific approach to evaluating whether offensive cyber capabilities will achieve the intended effects when called upon and avoid unintended effects. Doing so requires significant rigorous testing, data collection, and analysis efforts. So in conclusion, it's my view that the DoD cyber strategy lays out an ambitious set of goals that are well aligned to operationalizing cyber. However, implementing the initiatives needed to achieve these goals will be challenging due to the difficulties in quickly building and maintaining a capable workforce, assessing risk across the large number of DoD networks and systems, and planning for operations in this highly dynamic environment. Achieving the goals of the strategy will take time and significant resources. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this topic, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate all of y'all being able to get a lot into a short amount of time in your oral statements, but as I said, I appreciate your written statements as well. I think a lot of notable historical figures have made the point that it's more important to get the questions right in a way than it is to get the answers, or at least you ought to spend more time and effort focused on what the proper questions are before you attempt to find the answers. So I would just like to ask each of you, what is the primary proper question for us as policymakers to ask or to grapple with when it comes to cyber? I've thought that maybe it was what is the appropriate role of the military in defending the private sector infrastructure. Mr. Wallace kind of addressed that in his comments. But that may not be the most important question for us to ask. Maybe it's on the people's side, maybe it's something else. So without trying to steer you in any direction, for policymakers, what do you think the most important question or issue for us to grapple with when it comes to cyber and our country's security? Mr. Bailey?
Sir, I would define it as what is the acceptable level of loss for this country? For example, I don't want to equate the country to a store, but every store accepts a certain amount of shrinkage, in other words, theft from the store. We accept in the geopolitical realm a certain amount of instability. We have to define in this realm, what is it that we're willing to tolerate? You could argue simply by inaction, we're tolerating quite a bit right now in terms of theft of intellectual property, theft of personally identifiable information. Essentially, by inaction, we've determined that that is acceptable. Now, do we want to push back on that and say, no, we're not going to accept that? I think the president's done a little bit of that now with China, although we can talk more about that. But that, to me, is the central question. What is the acceptable level of loss, and how do you define that loss?
Okay. Mr. Wallace?
As I mentioned earlier, I think the appropriate role of the military is an important question. The other important question that I think needs to be asked is, in a world where technology is effectively leveling out the differences between countries and their ability to engage against each other, how does the U.S. and particularly the U.S. military maintain its advantage? And if that is no longer technology, I think the answer is likely to be in its ability to build alliances and in the quality of its people. But that doesn't happen by accident. That requires investment and forward planning.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Delfino?
I think the appropriate question is, how do we move from a stature of managing compliance to a stature of managing risk? Legislation can only be passed so frequently, and we're in a world where the dynamics of this is changing daily. And how do we really put a defensive posture in place and potentially an offensive posture in place that manages the risk with the association of potential DoD systems and infrastructure and military capabilities being breached.
Okay, good point. Dr. Schmidt?
I agree with Mr. Delfino. I think that the most important question in my mind is how is DoD postured to protect its own networks, its own data, its own missions against the evolving cyber threat? And it all comes down in the strategy to the implementation plan of a risk assessment approach.
Okay, I think there's more to pursue there, but I want to get to other members. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank our witnesses for your very insightful testimony. I guess I'd like to start first of all with Mr. Bedrick on your call for a federal CISO. And I've felt similar for quite some time. I've had legislation in for years now calling for a director's position in the executive office of the president that has both policy and budgetary authority to reach across government to compel departments and agencies to do what they need to do to close our cyber vulnerabilities. Right now, we do not have anyone in charge, ostensibly, in that respect. The closest we have is the cyber security coordinator, but it is a special assistant to the president position, but it's advisory and has no policy and budgetary authority. Not even the Secretary of Homeland Security doesn't even have the ability to reach across government and compel departments and agencies to do that. So you called for a federal cyber security officer. My vision had been that this director's position would apply mainly to the .gov domain. Are you suggesting that this federal chief information security officer would have jurisdiction both over DoD operations as well as .gov, or would you separate the two?
Thank you for the question, sir. I would separate the two. Traditionally in government IT, we have carved out DoD and IC systems from the rest of the approaches. And in my experience, DoD and the IC are doing the best job as far as defending themselves. They also have a unique culture in the sense that they do something called projecting friendly forces on the network. In other words, they assume that they're compromised and they're out there looking for the adversaries. This is a culture shift that needs to take place in the rest of the government, in the civilian side of the government. And that would be my initial mandate to the federal CISO, would be to bring that culture of going out there and looking for intruders in the federal networks, as opposed to continuing to build higher walls, which we do need to improve federal security, there's no doubt, but you need to have two missions: finding the intruders and kicking them out, and also improving security.
Good, thank you. So for the panel, when it comes to violence in the physical domain, society by and large manages to keep a lid on our worst impulses, or at least has established a countervailing structure of rule of law. However, we seem to have a deficit of structures of a similar nature with sufficient influence over cyberspace, particularly national issues. Moreover, it seems increasingly clear that we as a global society have a technical deficit when it comes to defense in cyberspace. The Internet ecosystem has not solved defense and defense agility in equal measure to the offensive capabilities it unleashes. Would you agree, and if so, how do we harness our S&T capabilities and our global influence to turn this picture around?
If I may, Congressman. You know, I think an element of this has to be compared to terrorism, right? Cyber terrorism is analogous to terrorism, and our enemy only has to be right once, and we have to be right every single time. So I think the effort that this nation has put into dealing with the threat of terror within the nation, we need to take similar aspects and attributes and efforts and put them into cyber terrorism as well.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Sir, if I could offer, when we think about risk as security professionals, we have three levers we can pull. There's vulnerability, there's the threat, and there's the consequences or cost of an intrusion. In my community, the technical community, we have spent way too much time, in my opinion, on the vulnerability side. It's important to reduce vulnerabilities, but we're moving to an Internet of Things where there are tens of billions of devices on the Internet, and trying to reduce the vulnerabilities in all of them is just too much. Similarly, on the cost side, we increasingly have more and more information on the Internet. So I do recommend that we do as much as possible to minimize. In fact, I saw Representative Buchanan has a bill to try to get rid of Social Security numbers and tax returns. I think that's a wonderful idea. But the one part of that equation that is really not exploding, I mean, it's growing, but not exploding, is the threat side. The head of Interpol the other day said that he estimates there's only about 100 malware kingpins in the world. These are the top-level guys who can write the worst malware for criminal purposes. 100 of them compared to tens of billions of devices we have to secure. I would put much more emphasis on, as Mr. Wallace mentioned, working with our allies, going after those criminal groups. I think that would bring a little bit more security to the internet.
Thank you. My last question, and I'll have others, but for right now, given time constraints, it's no secret that the cybersecurity workforce is challenged, and it can be difficult to mesh the private sector and the needs of government. Now, certainly, the National Guard plays an important role in bridging that divide, and I'm extremely proud to host the 102nd Network Warfare Squadron in the Rhode Island National Guard in my district. The Guard is and will remain a critical pathway for the DoD to access expertise that it otherwise, frankly, could not afford. It's an important model and one that has many variants. I'm reminded particularly of Estonia, which has a cyber defense league operating under a volunteer paramilitary model. Is the strategy being creative enough when it comes to ways to both integrate the capabilities of the Guard and access the capabilities of the private sector, be it through Secretary Carter's outreach to Silicon Valley, some paramilitary programs such as Estonia's, or any other model?
I very much agree that the National Guard offers important opportunities for ways to involve people in the implementation of the DoD's strategy, experts that wouldn't otherwise be able to be used. But I do think we need more work to understand exactly how that will work in the future and avoid slipping into a situation where we militarize problems that don't necessarily need to be militarized. There is a real question about how you spread responsibilities between civilian experts and military experts, and simply pulling the experts into the military isn't always the best solution. It may be the best way to deal with supporting warfighters in fighting wars, but in terms of defending civil infrastructure, one of the things we have to do is make sure that we better understand how the private sector and defense can work together.
If I could just add a few things. I think that your point about the National Guard and the Reserve Forces is an excellent one. They stand to provide the longevity that's required to maintain the technical depth that's necessary to perform these cyber mission roles. However, the question that I would ask is, are they well aligned with their expertise in their civilian sector jobs? Are they engaged in cyber activities there such that they can be bringing that expertise to DoD, or are they doing completely different things in their civilian lives? You also asked about is the strategy being innovative enough, forward-thinking enough to take on these new initiatives for getting the workforce that we need? And I think that one of the positive things that's happened lately has been the release of the new DoD Directive 8140, which basically aligns job roles with the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required to perform those roles, and identifies 3 separate categories of cyber-oriented jobs: an IT category, a cybersecurity category, and a cyber effects category. And this is the first time we've seen that kind of clarity coming out for workforce management. I think it stands to really align the training that's required to do those types of jobs and lay forward career progression that's an effective strategy for DoD.
Thank you, Dr. Schmidt. Mr. Delfino, do you have any comment?
I believe Dr. Schmidt covered most of my thoughts as well. I do believe that we need to have a consistent focus on recruiting the proper talent into those roles, whether they be military, civilian, Guard, reservists, et cetera, so on and so forth. And I do believe, as Dr. Schmidt outlined in her oral testimony, that the government can be competitive with the private sector marketplace, particularly when they target recruits and candidates who are early in career, and use methodologies like we have in the ROTC, where we can actually offer scholarships to these individuals going into universities and partner with the right universities with the right academic programs in computer science, and then have them serve some mandatory period of time postgraduate in their either a military or civilian capability to fight our cyber efforts.
Thank you. Fine, Mr. Petrick, do you have any comment?
Yes, sir. Quickly, I endorse Undersecretary Carson's work to make DoD more flexible. One of the things we should consider is being able to take an active duty person, have them work at FireEye for 2 years. We would love to have them and then send them back to DoD. We need this fluidity to go back and forth between the private sector and the public sector. Secondly, just as an issue with the Guard, I love the Guard. I've done some exercises with them. Sometimes they beat the regular forces at the fort. However, we have to be careful. Some of those same people who are working in the Guard, if the flag goes up and they have to do DoD duty, they're not going to be around to defend Bank of America or another place that we really care about. So that's why I'm partial to looking into a cyber force where we do have people whose job it is, if things get really bad, to take care of those bad problems.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have other questions, but I'll yield back this time.
Thank you. Mr. Forbes.
Chairman, first of all, I want to thank you for your leadership in this area and for having this hearing. I also want to thank Mr. Wilson for the efforts that his subcommittee is doing in this area and continues to do. And as the chairman said, sometimes it's important for us to ask the right question. In this area, there are so many questions to ask, and it's so big and so complicated. I'd like to maybe narrow in on just one. Under the current DoD practices, unclassified business system networks such as email and payroll are not defended as strongly as classified networks. Mr. Delfino, you've highlighted how an attack on an unclassified payroll system at DoD could impact the morale and families of DoD employees if the payroll system were to be compromised. You also mentioned an important point that as the department is implementing its network defense across the enterprise, it should review how it treats unclassified business system networks. As you know, these systems were recently the subject of a cyber attack. Do you think that DoD should be treating unclassified networks any differently than classified networks? And what recommendations do you have for the committee to improve their cyber posture?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Forbes. So I do believe while systems may be unclassified from a national security perspective or from a confidentiality perspective, they may be no less mission critical to the DoD or its efforts as well. And I don't believe they should be treated differently from a security posture perspective as it relates to its technology controls at all. And many times, these systems will, with less security, will be leveraged as a jumping off point for a hacker. This happens in private enterprise many, many times. We've seen it happen in multiple government attacks as well. And they should be treated with the same model. They should be treated with the same security controls, albeit they may be separated from the classified systems. It doesn't mean that there's a need for less security on those systems. And as I referred to, a zero trust security model or a microsegment security model would be one foundational aspect of how to secure those systems as well.
And we appreciate the expertise of all of our witnesses. Do any of you agree or disagree with Mr. Delfino in his assessment of the problem there?
I would just mention that the DoD is taking a risk management approach to managing the security of their networks, and that requires not only understanding how the systems are going to be used and the vulnerabilities, but also the threats. One of the large pieces of implementing a risk management framework, though, is tracing what missions use what systems, whether it's a computer or a server or an integrated circuit somewhere deep within a weapon system, and understanding how those missions are dependent on the computer systems that could be attacked. That's a huge analytic effort. It's difficult, and it's something that DoD is going to have to grapple with. Once they identify the risks to those systems, they would then protect them accordingly. And that's all part of a risk assessment initiative, and I agree with your original statement that it doesn't necessarily depend on classification. It depends on impact to the mission.
Good, thank you.
I would endorse the comments of Dr. Schmidt. I think in a risk management approach, some information will be inherently more sensitive than other bits of information. The trick in this new environment is understanding your risk and acting on it appropriately.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you so much. Good. Well, thank you all very much. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here and providing your sort of outside expertise. We appreciate it. You're all talking about risk management, risk assessment, and how important that is. I'm wondering if you feel that we should be exploring, or really, where do you think the tools of deterrence fit, and how are we developing those? How should we be developing those? What do you think makes sense?
Ma'am, I believe that there is a certain amount of deterrence in play now. There are actors who have the capability to cause substantial damage to different companies and organizations, and yet they don't. We've only seen a few examples: Sands Casino, apparently Iranian actors, Sony Pictures in the US, North Korean actors. There's plenty more that could be done, but it hasn't happened. So there is a certain amount of deterrence that is occurring. The question, though, has been at the sub-destruction level, the destruction of data, sub-physical level. There's been a lot of activity, mostly in the form of theft of business secrets. Hopefully that will change. I'm not sure if it will, but we'll see.
To what extent is the fact that we don't always know where things are coming from? I mean,
well, ma'am, in my testimony, I address attribution, and there's been a revolution in attribution over the last 5 years, both, I'd say, in the government, but also in the private sector. Just last week, two security companies essentially revealed the entire life story of a Chinese hacker operating out of Kunming. This is something that would have taken me months to do as in the military. So the attribution problem, as more and more of our lives are online, those are hackers too. They're online. And we're finding out who these guys are, even without having access to classified information. So attribution is much less of a problem than it was 5 years ago.
I'd just like to build on Mr. Bejlik's comments by adding that I think deterrence very definitely exists, but that deterrence of cyber threats doesn't have to happen within cyberspace. One of the most significant deterrents for nation states, particularly to attack the United States, is the fact that the United States is the biggest military power in the world. And adversaries know that if they step over a certain line, they will invite a response. That, as Mr. Bejlik points out, pushes the threats down to the level where below that which the United States would be willing to go to war. They're still tricky issues to manage, but to a large degree that counts as success, and means that at least a good proportion of those threats can be dealt with by other parts of government and the private sector themselves.
anybody else? Are you seeing that whole government response to deterrence, though? I guess are we doing a very good job with that? Bringing.
Ma'am, there's certainly been activities coming out of DOJ with the indictment of the 5 PLA officers. I actually met with 4 PLA colonels several months after that happened, and they were shocked that we had done that. So that certainly played a role. I know that USTR has been looking at some activities. So different parts of the government have been trying to do this. The effects, though, are what I'm waiting to see.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And on the DoD end of things, you're talking about trying to change an adversary's decision calculus, so you can do that also by raising the costs. So efforts to improve the resilience of DoD systems is certainly something that you could take into account in terms of deterrence. And also the advent of offensive operations that could be used to impose cost on the adversary, and better defenses that just make it harder for the adversary to attack.
Mm-hmm. Is there a role of sanctions in that as well?
Absolutely, yep.
Yeah, okay. Could you, one of the issues that we deal with here, and we had a discussion the other day about procurement, and the Department of Defense has had silo problems for years, and people not really having that whole of government approach as well. But I'm just wondering, within the cyber community, where adaption has to be so critical and so important, and moving quickly and making those changes, how would you assess the Department of Defense in that regard, in this area?
I think one of the key ways that DoD isn't quite as adaptive as you'd like to see is in the hiring. Lots of comments have been made about the speed with which the commercial sector can identify high-quality cyber personnel and hire them, but the slowness of especially on the civilian side. of
Personnel system, yes.
Yes, so I think that's one way that the DoD could improve to be able to be more competitive with the commercial sector.
Congressman, I think there's two answers for this question. As we talked about the people, I think we could talk a little bit about the technology now. As a vendor, the regulatory burden of doing business with the government is very high. It's unlike any other market that we play in. As a relatively young 16-year-old software company who does hundreds of millions of dollars in the public sector, including the DoD, for the most part, we don't hold direct contracts, but instead provide products and service through resellers and distributors who do hold contracts with the government. This is a fairly substantial impediment to younger technology companies who may have offerings that could substantially help the DoD. And the second of that is funding. It's difficult for the customer to find ways to acquire innovative technology following today's acquisition appropriations process. An IT cycle is 24 months. However, once the product is developed, there's often a delay in getting it into the government. So the private sector has the ability to in all reality, stay 2 to 3 years ahead of the government if they choose to do so.
Yeah. Thank you.
Chairman Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and Ranking Member Smith for arranging for Cyber Week this week. We have the hearing today, tomorrow again at 10, tomorrow afternoon. It's been a real honor for me to work with Congressman Langevin as the Ranking Member on emerging threats. This really has been a bipartisan effort to address the issues we have, and we also have an extraordinary professional staff, as I referenced in a 1 minute yesterday. For Mr. Baitlick and Mr. Wallace, and you've touched on this, and that is in regard to attribution. What is our capability, and then how much attribution is necessary or can be achieved to provide for a response, such as sanctions against individuals, businesses, military units, maybe a nation?
Sir, briefly, the way I like to think about attribution is that the government, the military, the IC have capabilities that exceed the private sector when you think about the source of attacks. They have the legal authority and they have the national technical means to get very close and to even infiltrate who the adversaries are. The private sector, on the other hand, our expertise tends to lie at the other end. We're with the victims, we're helping the victims, we're seeing what the adversary is doing within the victim companies. So when you put those two things together, we have a very good picture of what's happening. Now, the government doesn't necessarily tell us what they know. We tend to tell the government what we know by working through our customers. So you put those two things together, and when you add in the idea that attribution is ultimately a political question, it's not necessarily a technical question, you have very strong attribution capabilities now.
I would just add to what Ms. Baitlick said to say that the level of attribution you require depends what you want to achieve. And since it's a political decision, it depends what political acts you want to take. One of the most, I think, important things going forward is going to be able to take other nations with you in your actions. And that is going to require increasingly greater level of attribution and helping those countries understand the reasons that you're taking the actions that you are.
And Mr. Baitlick, I would look forward to receiving information about the hacker in Kunming. Ironically, my dad was stationed in Kunming with the 14th Air Force in World War II, and it always was, he was so grateful for the opportunity to protect the people of China from the attacks, and so it's somewhat ironic now that there would be attacks from there potentially. There should be a reminder of the relationships that we've had. And Dr. Schmidt and Mr. Delfino, something that I hope can be done. The technologies change so quickly, and to me there needs to be a real effort and advice, and I know Secretary Carter has been working on this, but what can be done to promote public-private partnership?
I do feel that there is a pretty strong public-private partnership, not only within the DoD, but throughout other U.S. government agencies as well. I think some of the risk that we manage today is due to the scale of legacy implementations that we have and the amount of effort it would take to moving something like the JIE. So I believe that through reading through the documents and the initiatives and the goals of the JIE, there has been a good amount of consultation between the DoD and the private sector as well, and I do believe it's reflected in that document as well. So I commend the DoD for that.
The topic of public-private partnership is a bit outside my area of expertise, but I will point you to the recent information sharing proposals that have come forward in various bills. And I think that the sentiment there is that while information sharing between the government and the public sector is possibly a beneficial arrangement, it's not necessarily a panacea. And there's testimony from my colleague Martin Libicki that explains that it depends upon the actions of the threat actors, and if they can get inside the time with which we can share information from the government to the corporate sector, it may not have the benefits that it's designed to have.
And we look forward to all of you in providing information to us on how we can expedite a public-private partnership. And a final for Mr. Bakeley, is there any way for us to respond back where there's been a hacking?
Yes, sir. I think the notion of hackback is something that's often asked of the private sector. I believe the state should retain the monopoly on force and retain that as a potential state function.
Thank you very much.
Interesting question. We probably have more questions to ask about. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Batelich, do you believe it's worthwhile for the federal government to initiate negotiations with other nations when it comes to avoiding cyber conflict, cyber war?
Yes, sir, I do. I think the example with China is a good one where it was difficult for us to establish a norm saying that we should not steal each other's secrets in order to provide them to the private sectors of each countries. Now that we've actually established that as a norm publicly, I think it's a good idea to take to other locations.
Does anyone disagree with that on the panel or have anything to add to it?
I would just add that we already have norms, even laws, that against countries going to war with each other. What we actually need to seek to do is find ways to avoid that happening almost by accident. So we shouldn't throw out all of the experience or the international law that exists. We need to better understand how we integrate cyber into those frameworks.
Is there a role for a international organization such as the UN in this new cyber arena where there needs to be clear rules established for conduct of folks internationally, both private and or both government and non-government entities?
So the United Nations is already engaged in this area. They have a group of government experts who've been meeting over a number of years to sit around a table and negotiate, or at least agree the norms of behavior that should exist. They have essentially over a number of years agreed that what happens, that international law should apply. What I think possibly we have to do now is move into other fora where blocking countries, those countries who make life difficult, are not present, and move together to try and implement some other norms a little bit more aggressively.
Do you see a future where the U.S. goes it alone and seeks to be the world superpower, dominant, in control, and kind of a go-it-alone attitude about the cyber arena when it comes to just dominance and enforcement? I know I'm not being eloquent with my question, but I think you might know what I mean.
Sir, I do know what you mean, and it's interesting. This is one of the fears some of other countries have. The Chinese, for example, are very aware that much of the hardware, or not necessarily the hardware, you know, they make the hardware over there, but we make the software. We have the innovative companies. We have the protocols. We have the core of the stakeholder agreements that run the internet. and they're looking for a way to better integrate and in some ways exert their own control over that. So I do believe this idea of more inclusion for all the affected parties matters. It was different, years ago when we were the dominant force in terms of users. Now we're rapidly becoming less and less compared to the hundreds of millions of people elsewhere.
If I could just add a few points, you'll notice that the DoD strategy points to the need to build partnerships with international players on this line, not necessarily to dominate, as you asked originally, but to build security and safety for all the players.
Thank you, and Al, you're back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. We now proceed to Congressman Whitman of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the members of the panel for joining us today. Several of you had mentioned earlier concerning members of the military and, number one, their abilities, but also what we would do to make sure they have the proper education within cybersecurity. And let me get your perspective on several different levels. How important is it for us as a nation to train our future military leaders specifically in the realm of cybersecurity, not just a cursory introduction, but an in-depth educational experience at our service academies, through our ROTC programs? And secondly, how important is it for us to make sure that every enlistee in every branch of the services get some level of training and education within cybersecurity? It seems to me that having a higher level of expertise throughout the service ranks would be a great advantage to us, especially with the eyes and ears and the skills that they might have to be on the lookout, but also to think intuitively and creatively about not only how to prevent cyber attacks, but look about how we can be better defensively, but also things we could do on the offensive side. So I'd like to get your perspective on that on both of those levels.
Yes, sir. I agree with your idea of over the entire spectrum of someone's career. My wife was an operations officer at a basic training squadron in the Air Force. I know the schedule is tight, but that 18-year-old enlisted person is the way into the force many times. So don't put them through some boring set of slides where they just look and sort of stare at it. Put them through a little exercise where they're in front of a computer, they get that email, they go to that website, whatever it is, so that they know what it looks like. I also think it needs to be taught at the academies, as you mentioned, at the mid-level and senior-level schools. But this is also, I think, where the cyber force comes in. We need people who can defend themselves. We also need those people who think about this in that domain, and that is the way that they approach this problem. And that's what I think. I firmly believe in 20 years we're going to look back and wonder, how did we not have such a capability?
I think it's essential that we have better cyber education, as I've already argued. I think there are two separate aspects to that education: cybersecurity and awareness of the vulnerabilities, both at a personal level and at an institutional level. Also an awareness of cyber operations. I disagree with Ms. Bailey. I think embedding an understanding of cyber operations within the current services may be a more sensible way forward, but I think we both agree that having a better appreciation of how wars will be fought in the cyber context is going to be essential for military leaders, and that has to start right at the beginning of their military education.
Mr. Delfino?
So I think certainly those people in positions in the military leading people whose primary objective is cyber efforts need to have very deep cyber expertise themselves and not just be, a more generalized leader. I think as it relates to the more general or the broader enlisted servicemen and women, they certainly need to be trained on best practices to prevent themselves from becoming a point of compromise and entry into the DoD infrastructure, and also need to learn that what happens if in mid-mission a system that they are using or dependent upon for that mission is breached and is no longer there. How would they deal with that from a circumstances perspective as well? So I would not attempt to turn every enlisted member into a cybersecurity expert. It is likely infeasible.
Dr. Schmidt?
I think research shows that it requires a depth of expertise in the cyber workforce, but also in the leaders of the cyber workforce. I think there's a tendency to think that managers can just have a broader understanding, but our research indicates that that's not the case. And to keep up with the technology trends, the evolving threats, the leaders also have to be deep in their expertise, and so I would support a deeper cyber education for military leadership, DoD leadership. and that has to be refreshed over time due to the dynamic nature of the cyberspace.
One additional question. How important is pay to retain those experts across the spectrum of needed expertise, but also in the different areas of the service branches, both on the civilian side and the uniformed service side?
So pay is important, but it's not everything. In 2001, when I got out of the Air Force, I didn't get out because I wasn't making enough money. I got out because there was no career path. I would have gladly stayed. I would have been more inclined to stay if I knew I could go to private sector for a couple years, go back into the military. You can do things in the military you can't do anywhere else, so it's quite a retention bonus.
Any other thoughts, Mr. Delfino?
Yeah, and I addressed this in my written testimony as well. I think pay is a component of it, and I do believe that the government can be competitive there and the DoD as well. I believe it's also a training and investment, an ongoing training and development investment to keep these people sharp. The ability for them to get industry accreditations that they can use post their service, either in the military or as a civilian in the Department of Defense as well. And a career path I also highlighted in my written testimony is very, very important for these individuals as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And thank you, Chairman Whitman. We now proceed to Mr. O'Rourke of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Betlick, you said earlier that perhaps the most important question for us to answer is the amount of loss that we're willing to tolerate. And I like that because if we had a chief information security officer, that's a level to which we hold that person accountable and responsible for. If we are trying to communicate consequences to our adversaries, we can say, you know, this is the level, whereas now it's a little ambiguous. How would you advise us to proceed in answering that question? What are the factors that you take into account, and do you have an answer to it?
Sir, I do. I would start by taking a look at the metrics we use to assess whether we're winning or not. The way I like to describe it is this. We spend a lot of time measuring the height of our players, how fast they run the 40, where they went to college, and we don't figure out what the score of the football game is. So we're doing a lot of input metrics. We're not taking a look at what the outcome of the game is. So the outcome of the game in cyberspace for me would be how many intrusions are occurring over a certain period of time, what were the consequences of those intrusions, how quickly did we find out that it had happened? Just to give you an example, front page of USA Today the other day said, Energy hacked 159 times in 4 years. This is a step in the right direction, but this doesn't say how bad was it, what actually happened. I could look at this and say, this isn't actually too bad. So we need to turn more towards metrics like this and less from we have certain numbers of systems patched and so forth.
And in terms of communicating that level of tolerance to an adversary, is that something that is made explicit? If you do this, these will be the consequences, both cyber and perhaps physically, militarily, for crossing this red line or this threshold?
I think there needs to be something like that, and I know Secretary Panetta at one point said that in, I think it was October 2011 speech he gave, where he said if there is significant consequence to the power sector, financial, he laid out certain categories that they would be met by a response, not just, as Mr. Wallace mentioned, in cyberspace, but outside of cyberspace. So we have to keep measuring, we have to keep delivering that message, and when something significant happens, like OPM, we should take a response. We just can't say, well, this is something that we would have done as well. In the Cold War, when someone, when a spy ring was uncovered, we didn't say, well, the Soviet Union spies. We'd kick them out. We might kick out the ambassador. So there can be consequences that signal our disapproval of that action.
Mr. Wallace, I really enjoyed your analogy comparing what we're doing today to the development of military aviation prior to World War II. And you seem to suggest that in the United States we were rewarding risk-taking and through that attracting the best and brightest and ensuring that they had career advancement connected to that risk-taking and that advancement of military aviation. What can you give me a specific example of what we are not doing in the U.S. if we are in fact not doing that today in cyber, and perhaps to ask it in a positive way, what we could be doing, what we should be doing, and as specific as you can get?
So I would say in defense of the commanders of today that back in the 1920s, the U.S. Navy had a very clear sense of who its adversary was likely to be and worked around that. But I think they were more imaginative, and they did take steps that are not being taken today. One very specific example is Admiral King, when he was a captain, quite advanced in his career, was taken and trained as an aviator so that he had the qualifications, because Congress had passed laws to say that you needed to be an aviator in order to command an aircraft carrier. Therefore, as some other senior officers got that qualification, so they understood not only the actual process of flying an aircraft, but also had an appreciation of the tactics that would be required and the organization, putting the carrier at the center of the battlefield rather than the battleship, that would be necessary to go on and prevail in the operations that followed in the 1940s.
What's the analogy to cyber? What are we not doing? Who's not getting the training? Is it senior commanders within the Department of Defense?
Rather than treating cyber operators off to the side as the sort of techies, it's integrating cyber into military operations and having those people who understand cyber operations as part of the group of people who go on to command full spectrum operations.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. We now proceed to Congressman Rich Nugent of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this panel. I sit on ETC, and we hear, obviously, in classified settings, issues as it relates to how we're going to do certain things. But I guess what strikes me, though, is what we can tolerate or what we're willing to tolerate. And I don't know that we have a whole lot of discussion on that. And so then when you start saying, okay, what are the consequences to your actions? And they're really, that's pretty undefined also. Do you think to date that we have been, I guess, succinct enough to talk about consequences to actions, particularly as it relates to just China and what's gone on? We heard about the fact that we indicted 5, prior law enforcement. That would be a problem for me if we indicted them and they were resident in the United States or we had extradition abilities. But I mean, that sounds good, but what other consequences have we imposed when we clearly know who the actors were? And it's just not China. I mean, there's other actors out there, Russia, Iran, and others, and North Korea. What other sanctions have we imposed to date? Can anyone speak to that?
Sir, my own personal experience, I've been working intrusions by Romanian hackers, Russians, Chinese, criminal nation state for, in the private sector, post-military for 13, 14 years now, and we are only now seeing consequences. Now, there has been a decent amount of law enforcement work that's been done, but in terms of going after, say, businesses that have benefited from the theft of commercial information, we still haven't done that.
Please. I would say that I think we have to remember that the issue is bounded. There is a level which I think adversaries know that they shouldn't go. There is also the fact that that law enforcement does take care of cyber intrusions in many more friendly countries around the world. So there's a small area. And in relation to the PLA-5, the colonels were indicted. I think there is a debate as to whether that was the right tactical action, but I think one thing that could be said in favor of it is at least it began the process of preventing a negative norm, the idea that countries can act with impunity and not have any kind of acknowledgement that that's unacceptable behavior.
I'll just add to that there may be times where we want to respond offensively, cyberly, while maintaining confidentiality and not taking responsibility for those responses as well, in order to not divulge our level of sophistication in our responses as well.
I agree.
And to build on that, one of the things that the DoD strategy has set out as a goal is to be able to respond when a contingency comes up, and the desire is to implement an offensive cyber capability. I think one of the critical areas where we need to be working is ensuring that commanders know how those offensive cyber capabilities will perform if they're called upon to be used. And we could be doing more in that area to characterize their performance and ensure that they do not have unintended effects.
I agree. The one statement that was made, and I think Mr. Delfino, you were talking about, is our reliance on technology within the military is so high, whether it's ground troops, obviously air troops, whether it's naval engagements. Are we doing enough in regards to challenging those members of the military to say, okay, this system crashed or is down because of a cyber attack? Are we doing enough in any of your estimation to, I guess, work around that particular issue? Are we doing enough within the military?
I think it's a good question. I think there's three attributes of what we do, you know, people and process, and the third one being technology. Are we doing enough? Are we giving these people the technology they need fast enough and the funding that they need fast enough to make the changes that they need to prevent those or recover from them when they happen? I think is a good question, and is part of why we see this JIE initiative, because I think that they've noted that the legacy approaches that they've been taking have increased complexity substantially, and it's a big challenge for them.
Just briefly, sir, I agree with your sentiment. We need to war game with major systems not being available, GPS and so forth, and see how people respond.
Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. I yield back. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff Nugent. We now proceed to Mr. Aguilar of California. And I want to thank Congressman Aguilar. He actually came early, so this is good.
And stuck around late. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. Bailich, you mentioned in your testimony, I think the fifth point, how the administration should develop asymmetric capabilities to target the core interests of the bad actors. And you mentioned one. And building off of what Mr. Nugent mentioned, you talked about the censorship network in China. What other asymmetric examples do you believe are available, not only with respect to China, but other actors like Russia?
You know, it's interesting you mentioned Russia. No one really talks about the degree of instrumentation they have in their country. They are, one of the interesting aspects of the Russia-China dynamic is that they have agreed to work on internet security mechanisms. And what that really means is internet control mechanisms, dissident suppression mechanisms. So they are developing software to make it easier for them to target their dissidents both inside and outside the country. So just as easily as we could go after the Great Firewall, we could look for vulnerabilities in that software that those two countries are developing and figure out ways to exploit it, degrade it, potentially even render it inoperable. Clearly, control is important to those regimes, and I gave one example of the Great Firewall in China, but there's similar activities you could do elsewhere.
In what other countries? What other examples?
Well, if we're going to talk, you know, the big ones we worry about, North Korea, you know, their core interest is in the stability of the regime and keeping out outside influence. So we could work on ways to better, you know, right now there are people sending DVDs into North Korea using balloons. We could potentially get SATCOM or mesh network equipment into that country and make it easier for people to get information in real time rather than having to wait for a balloon to make it across the border.
Thank you. Mr. Bailich, you also mentioned in the discussion about collaboration and public-private partnerships, the potential to embed folks, my words, not yours, in private companies. Can you talk a little bit about structurally how that would work, how you would have liked that to work in 2000, 2001 when you were still in the military service?
It's a great question. So I was an incident responder in the Air Force. I would have loved to have been able to go to Mandiant for 2 years. Didn't exist at the time, but let's say now. You go to Mandiant, you do incident response for 2 years inside private companies. You learn how to use the tools that the private sector uses. You learn what private sector networks look like. You learn what the adversary does in those environments. At the same time, the private sector company learns from your capabilities, and you have to respect classification and all that, but that dynamic is what makes for a powerful capability. And then, so after the 2-year period, I would go back into the military, and I would continue down my career path, and perhaps even go back at a later time, maybe as an executive, maybe at another time go in and teach. While we do have a great educational system in this country, there's many people who think that security is encryption. We need more people who have spent time in the trenches teaching that next generation of security professional.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Mr. Aguilar. We now proceed to Congresswoman Jackie Walorski of Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panel, for being here. I appreciate it. I represent Indiana, where I know you mentioned this has been talked about before. The National Guard is looking at those new cyber force teams, and we're thrilled that Indiana is going to be involved in our National Guard. But I just had a question. I think, Mr. Wallace, you had talked about the possibility of over-relying on DoD and defending the nation from cyber threat. In August, I was on a trip to Czech Republic, and in Czech Republic, the subject of Estonia came up in the 2007 giant cyber attack in Estonia, and they developed the Cyber Defense League, and I know that our DoD has worked somewhat with that, but any of you can answer this question, but I looked at that and some of the things a little tiny nation was able to do with really building an alliance very quickly. Is that a model that our country looks at? I know we're somewhat a part of it, but can you speak to the significance or the success Estonia has had as opposed to where we are? Is that something we should look at more seriously?
I do. I think Estonia has the advantage of being small, 1.7 million people. They can be nimble. They had a threat that was very visible to the entire country. In this country, I think we could have, in addition to the cyber force, we could have something like a cyber corps. Now, I know there's one that exists, but it's not really very popular. I'm thinking more of like a Peace Corps model where you get some training, you go to a one-month boot camp, and then you can deploy within either our country or perhaps even overseas, and you can be that cybersecurity expert for that small to medium-sized business. I would love to hire a person like that who had just been through a 2-year program out in the field. There's a big difference between book learning and learning out on the job. So there's, I think, many ways to involve people, not just in the military, but through government service to improve their cybersecurity.
Mr. Wallace?
I would completely agree with that. I think Estonia is a particular case. Its history and its small size, the fact that people tend to know each other, but I do think there is something in the fact that the Cyber Defense League is both a military and a non-military organization. And I think the idea that to be involved in national security, you have to be in uniform is something that in the age of sort of cyber capabilities we need to move away from. And something that as Richard suggests, that takes a more imaginative approach to how we manage some of the threats we face is definitely something that could well be explored.
And is there a benefit in displaying some offensive cyber capabilities in some way that we do possess as a nation? Or it seems that of all the hearings that I've sat in, we always hear the lack, the holes, things we could be doing better. Are there things that we actually do right now that are kind of like the kingpins that hold us together to be able to at least get the information that we have without going into anything that we've classified? But is there a benefit in kind of letting the world know that we're not just playing catch up? There are things to at least get out there in the cyber world that we are doing, or something like that?
I think there's a benefit to doing the offense. I don't know that there's a benefit to displaying it.
So how would we do the offense, and what would we do internally? When would we do that? Because it seems like that isn't happening.
Well, and I think, there are things that we don't know that we assume that the U.S. does because we're not taking responsibility for that, right? Stuxnet in the Iranian nuclear reactor would be a good example of that, right? And I don't know that we've proclaimed credit for that, nor do I think we should.
Right.
However, leaving the enemy guessing about was that a response for something I did may be a very good tactic offensively.
Yeah. Mr. Wallace?
I also think that we shouldn't necessarily think of offensive cyber operations purely in the context of a standalone covert operation, which are probably outside the realms of sort of the DoD's Title X mission. that actually there may well be opportunities within a warfighting context where you can save lives, both the lives of U.S. personnel and indeed civilians and perhaps even enemy, by using capabilities, putting down a air defense capability that you couldn't do with kinetic weapons. And I think there is, it's difficult to demonstrate, but over time could prove extremely important.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll get back.
And thank you, Ms. Morolowski. And we now proceed to Mr. Ashford of Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been extremely interesting to me. This conversation, and I've learned a lot. One of the, of course, that was dramatized in the movie at Benchley Park when Ultra was developed during World War II. And one of the parts, and you've talked about this a little bit, but maybe we could talk about just a little more, but the idea, the cultural sort of obstacles that we saw at Benchley Park at the beginning, before the code was broken and during that whole process. I realize it's a while ago, but Mr. Wallace talked about the prior to World War II and the developments in Britain. And you've talked about the cultural thing, but I'm really intrigued by it. I know in Omaha, where I'm from, Omaha, Nebraska, there are many young private sector tech startup companies that have had maybe some history with these kinds of matters. And you've talked about it, but how do we break down those cultural barriers? Could you go through that once again? How do we encourage people to work on this? They can go back to the private sector. I get that. Would you say these cultural barriers are significant? Are they being worked on? What's your vision, time frame wise, to kind of break down some of these boundaries and obstacles to integration and getting the best people working on these issues? And maybe just
Certainly. So my observation has been, in certain parts, there's more supply than demand. So the Army has gone through a very successful exercise of putting out a call for new people or people within the service now who want to go into cyber, and they've gotten many applicants. Things are going well. The question is, where are they going to be in 2 years or 4 years? You've already seen the attempt to build the cyber mission forces and other parts at Cyber Command. They're still struggling to fill those spots. I do think when you're looking at military personnel, ultimately, how are they rewarded? How are they viewed compared to their peers? In the Air Force, if the pilots were the top. You're not going to get a cyber commander of the Air Force. You're not maybe even going to get an intel commander of the Air Force. You could probably get an airlift commander of the Air Force, but you're not going to get some of these other people. So I think if you want to be able to keep and retain the best for the longest period of time, you're going to eventually have to break them off and have them be their own. Now, that doesn't mean no cyber in the other forces. I think tactical cyber supporting physical missions should remain with the other services. Cyber it's in everybody's lives. But I think that at the end of the day, strategic cyber is probably going to have to be its own service with its own culture and its own ethos.
Mr. Wallace?
Practice, wargaming, going through the motions, working between the services, bringing in the private sector to go through scenarios that reflect events that may happen in the future is, to my mind, the best way of identifying the problems, getting people of different cultures to understand ahead of the point where they have to do it for real, where the other people are coming from. And to the point that Congressman O'Rourke made about analogies, one of the real triumphs of the interwar years was practicing and trying things out before having to do them for real, and developing new concepts off the back of that. And I think that's going to be important in this area too.
Thank you.
I would just add, in the context of public-private partnership in this area, you could make a private sector job rotation, a condition of promotion to the senior executive service as well as part of this.
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Schmidt?
Well, with regard to rotating between public and private, I think one of the key problems that DoD faces is retaining the highly skilled folks around the 6 to 8 year mark. And that's in fact what Mr. Balick was talking about the time that he was starting to get interested in the commercial sector. So if there can be something done to help retain those folks either through incentives to stay in or for other opportunities to rotate to the commercial sector, that could help solve one of DoD's primary problems.
Right. Thank you very much. I think we've talked a lot about that with the NDA this year to try to think about how do we retain, and in this area, it's a significant challenge. So thank you very much. I yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Gabbard?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, the issue that you're bringing up of how to just completely change the way we think about how we bring in the best talent to deal with these cybersecurity challenges, and thinking outside the traditional concept of, well, it has to be a uniform if you're dealing with the Department of Defense, I think is really at the crux of all this, to make sure that we are on the cutting edge of this constantly changing and dynamic area. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on Secretary Carter's implementing this initiative to work closer with Silicon Valley, what you see may be the pros and cons of that, how we can benefit, or maybe what some of the barriers are to the DoD being able to really get the best of what that policy, I think, hopes to accomplish.
Just 2 quick points, ma'am. I'd like to endorse Mr. Delfino's earlier comments about the difficulty of small companies doing business with DoD. And on a related point, when we're operating under continuing resolutions, it's tough to get new programs going. And so that's been a challenge for the private sector for the last several years.
I would just add that I think it is absolutely essential that the DoD has access to the best technology available. But I also think it's important to recognize that working with Silicon Valley is not a silver bullet. There are good reasons why Silicon Valley companies who depend on international markets for their entire business model, that they're not necessarily going to roll over and work with the DoD in the way that the DoD might necessarily want. So I think it's important, but it's not the silver bullet. And nor do I think the DoD thinks it is. But
sure. Sure.
I would just like to point out that I think things like pursuing personnel that have STEM degrees in electrical engineering, computer science, information technology would go along a lot further than a couple of small initiatives associated with Silicon Valley.
I would have to agree extensively with Dr. Schmidt here. I don't think this problem should be that complicated. I think if you are pursuing a career in cybersecurity or information technology as a long-term investment, I'm sure many of us would be thrilled to hire folks who worked in cybersecurity in U.S. Department of Defense or other U.S. intelligence agencies as well, and they would be rewarded greatly. So I think this is about keeping the pipeline of talent coming in. I'm sure that we don't want the DoD to become the training ground for information technology and cybersecurity across America. However, our ability to attract that young talent going into university and coming out of university, particularly from those acclaimed universities, is something that the DoD can successfully do.
Thank you. And forgive me for coming in late if you've already addressed this. If you could briefly state the major cybersecurity breaches that we've seen across the federal government, really within the last several months, would you say those are primarily attributed to a lack of technical capability, or is this a larger policy issue?
I don't think this is so much as a policy issue, and I don't think they differentiate dramatically from those that we are seeing in the private sector either. There are common exploits that the attackers are using across both public and private sector, as well as military and classified networks as well. I've addressed this to some extent in my written statement. We continue to see this, and until we change the technology that we are using, we are going to continue to see this. The private sector exploits at Target and Home Depot and JPMorgan Chase that we saw were 3 years ago from companies who are extremely sophisticated, wildly intelligent, and have massive technology budgets. And it is there are some fundamental, foundational network architecture problems that are allowing these attacks to continue to happen. And until we change the way we build and construct these and automate these infrastructures as well, both from a putting security in to defending once we see a cyber attack. We will likely continue to see these issues.
Do you see those changes being implemented in the private sector?
They're being implemented, they are in the acceleration stage of being implemented in the private sector. So these are things that are not new now. People get the reason why. They've tried traditional methods. I would point you back to General Keith Alexander's comment, the former director of the National Security Agency. I look at the DoD architectures today, and defending them is really hard. We have 15,000 enclaves, each individually managed. People are starting to realize that physical separation, can get you security to a point, but as you start to scale, it becomes unmanageable, operationally infeasible, and over time becomes so complex you actually may get reduced security from it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank each of you for your input today. And Mr. Bejtlich, with your military background, what is the role that DoD should have in protecting the critical infrastructure from cyber attack and or intellectual property from cyber espionage?
Thank you for the question, sir. As I mentioned in my written testimony, I think it's difficult to have the DoD directly involved at the customer end of this problem. For the most part, these sectors don't want troops stationed nearby. They don't want government sensors on their networks. So I feel that that's the realm of the private sector and those entities themselves, which can be guided perhaps through better incentives and regulation. But I think that as far as DoD is concerned, I would put pressure on those adversaries twofold. One, you want to know what they're up to so you can interdict their activities. And two, you want to introduce some friction into their activities so that they just don't have free rein against their targets. And then when they do see something coming down the pike, you got to warn those targets that this is about to happen and work with them to try to prevent that breach from occurring.
And specifically, I'm concerned about the electrical grid. And so what would be a DoD role to protect the electrical grid for the people of the United States?
Well, I would identify which foreign actors are considering trying to take down the power grid. I would target their activities, and when I see them trying to or planning to do something like that, I would hit them preemptively. This is one of the cases where it would be worth the gain loss and the intel equation to disrupt their activities and potentially lose a source rather than sit back and have to recover from a power grid failure.
And for anyone who would like to answer, I'm really concerned about DoD protecting its networks and mission systems from attack. Has this adequately been provided?
I think that's yet to be determined. Certainly the risk management approach that they've put in place is an excellent step in the right direction, but it all comes down to the implementation of that framework. I think identifying the vulnerabilities and, more critically, their tie to missions is what it's all going to come down to. I think that the strategy doesn't fully describe how they'll implement that objective, and I'd like to hear more about the implementation specifically for mission systems and how it relates to critical DoD missions.
And I'm particularly concerned about the systems relative to air defense. Would anybody comment on that? Or missile defense?
Sir, just it's interesting you bring that up. Air defense is one of the physical systems that has an attack, a cyber attack associated with it. Apparently there has been, the Israeli Air Force did something to Syria at some point in the last 5 years. We don't really have any unclassified corroboration of this. I'm not saying I have classified corroboration, I'm just saying this is what I've read. So it is potentially a system that has seen a physical effect due to cyber.
And I have a great concern about the capabilities of DPRK, the North Korea, and its capability of intercontinental ballistic missiles with an inability on our part to protect the American people. Is that a legitimate concern?
So I think, there are elements of the DoD and the government, specifically STRATCOM is doing very well at this, the DISA MilCloud is doing very well at this, and specifically the Missile Defense Agency is doing well in implementing automation and cloud-based technologies and the appropriate security technologies to protect that infrastructure from DPRK or other nation-state actors as well.
And a challenge is developing is the capability of mobile missiles being developed by such a extraordinary challenge and threat to us. And so again, I want to thank you for being here, and we all look forward to your input to protect the American people. I yield.
Thank you. Mr. Langsman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also, earlier I was remiss in not acknowledging and thanking Chairman Wilson for his leadership on this issue as well. He's been a real pleasure working with him as the chairman, as me as the ranking member, but he as the chairman as the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee. He's really done a deep dive on this, and I appreciate his leadership. So thank you to both chairmen. So if I could just, a couple last questions that I had. Given your disparate backgrounds, if each of you could see the DoD CIO successfully and fully implement just one policy, what would it be? Mr. Bedford, you want to start with you and go right down the line?
Sir, I think you win the question for, or you win the toughest question award in the hearing. I would like to see a strategy that is based, first of all, a strategy that is based on recognizing that adversaries will get into the network, that the goal should be to minimize what they can do, and that you achieve that by seeing them as quickly as possible and containing them. And then being a beacon for the rest of the government. This is one of the few areas, I think, where, or not one of the few areas, but this is an area where DoD does a pretty good job already. So taking that expertise and leveraging it and teaching the rest of the government would be a great achievement.
Thank you.
I'm afraid that question probably takes me beyond my level of expertise, but I certainly don't disagree with what Mr. Balick said, that the making sure that the DoD's expertise is leveraged by the rest of government and learning the lessons. DoD is not perfect, but taking those lessons and leverage them across government, I think is an opportunity that should be taken.
Congressman, I'll simply respond by saying I think if the DoD only did one thing, we would have a much bigger problem. I think the first thing they need to do is recognize that this is a multifaceted, complex problem which requires multiple serial strategies being put in place simultaneously to address. So if they only do one thing, or there is really not one thing that is more important than the many things that need to be done here. And I do think that the joint information environment is a good step in the right direction, caveating the successful execution and implementation of that technology.
I think DoD has recently issued policies that are aimed at securing the cyber acquisition chain. So from looking at major weapon systems acquisition and thinking about how to properly do that such that they're defensible in the future, I think that that's been a good step. What I think could also be needed is looking at legacy weapon systems, the ones that are already fielded and that where the cyber acquisition policies won't come into play as effectively. What can DoD do to make sure that those legacy weapon systems are cyber secure?
Thank you. And if I could, Dr. Schmidt, I find your testimony regarding deliberate planning for cyber operations very interesting. What should we do today to enable the kind of deep analytic work you refer to?
So I'm referring to deliberate planning for cyber operations in terms of getting those offensive capabilities ready to be used in case they're called upon to do so. And so commanders need to have the confidence in those kind of capabilities that they have in conventional weapons. So we've had decades upon decades of experimentation and test and very rigorous test designs, data collection and analysis efforts that have led to, on the conventional side, deep physics models and an understanding of how those weapons are going to perform when they're called upon to be used. I think we need exactly the same thing on the offensive cyber side, and that's going to require an investment in designing those kinds of tests to explore how they're going to be used, what the operational conditions will be in those settings, and especially to ensure that the offensive cyber capabilities don't have unintended effects, because only then will commanders have the confidence that's required to employ those kind of capabilities to contribute to the deterrence that we desire.
You know, is DOD paying enough attention right now to that, to, in a sense, the war gaming these types of things out, and so that they fully understand the capabilities that they have at their disposal and how to use them?
I think it's a growing area of concentration. I definitely think more could be done to make sure that we characterize the capabilities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. I want to, I guess, in some ways, follow through on some of that. I don't think we've talked too much about supply chain, and yet there are very few things DoD buys these days that don't have some component, either the hardware or the software, that comes from other places. And you know, mostly when we talk about cyber, we're think about networks and going through the internet to have effects somewhere else. But do any of y'all have suggestions on this supply chain issue where there may be corrupted, tampered hardware or software that that makes it into important systems that create vulnerabilities for us? And probably, my guess is, there's no way we can be assured of finding it all. So what do we do?
So I think, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is why we have to move to a model where there is no longer a trusted element inside of the infrastructure as well. Whether it was maliciously tampered with by a private entity or a foreign government or somebody within the United States itself, or it is just many of these devices that we're finding today to be put into networks have software in them that has known vulnerabilities, right? And I don't know that the DoD has the ability to test every single device that comes into its infrastructure itself. And this moves to the model where we have to have, there is no longer people outside the perimeter are untrusted and people within the perimeter are trusted. Everybody has to be treated as an untrusted entity, so that at the time that that device or piece of software tries to propagate malware or a virus or spyware within the environment, it can be detected automatically and shut down and defended against.
Sir, just briefly, I come at it from a slightly different angle. I come at it from the counterintelligence perspective. Best way to find out if the adversary has ways into your system is to be inside theirs and notice, hey, these guys are getting into our systems, or they have a plan to do so, or they have a team that's standing up to do that activity. That could be potentially another way to find out what's happening.
Both Mr. Balick and Mr. Wallace say that the federal government, the military, should not defend private infrastructure. Although Mr. Balick says, well, we ought to create some friction, you know, don't let them have it too easy, which is kind of an interesting subplot. So if I'm a major company, if I own a bunch of refineries in the Houston Ship Channel and a bunch of bombers come, you know, my way, I know what I expect the United States Air Force to do to protect me. A bunch of packets come against those same refineries from somewhere. I may or may not have the ability to get the attribution on that. I take your point on attribution. So the federal government is not going to defend me. So I'm left on my own. And my options then are to sit there and take it, or have, if I'm sophisticated enough, some sort of retribution on my own, which leads to all sorts of problems. Now, is that really a good scenario? And if other nation states or terrorist organizations or Russian mafia know that we won't defend these companies, doesn't that open it up? And they know how far to go and to take advantage of it. So explain to me why that's a preferable way of doing things.
Can I just clarify my
Yeah,
position
of course.
on
I obviously summarize in great generalities.
So, in extremis, I absolutely believe that it's the role of the military to defend the United States against attacks of a serious consequence. What I think is important, however, is to avoid the military becoming the first place that the private sector turns to when it feels under threat. There is a number of other places that they can go. Firstly, others in the private sector to improve not only their capabilities to defend themselves, but also their resilience when they do get attacked, that deterrence by denial, if you like. Secondly, I think it's not necessarily the case that in this area that you need to be wearing a uniform and having gone through military training to be a federal government employee supporting the private sector. And so it doesn't need to be the case that the military has to be the place, even within the federal government, that the private sector would turn to when it feels it needs to. And so my point is not necessarily that the military shouldn't defend the private sector in certainly, particularly in a warfighting environment where the homeland is under threat as a result of what the military is potentially doing overseas, there needs to be cooperation. But I do think that if the military becomes the first place everyone turns to, that's going to be a burden which the military cannot bear in the long term.
Sir, if I could address it as well. I agree with what Mr. Wallace said, but I'd also like to mention two things. One, would the government have been effective as it was with, say, OPM? Maybe not. Who knows? So the second issue is one of time. I think there's a perception, and you probably even hear it from some of the witnesses, not here, thankfully, but sometimes witnesses wearing uniforms, where they talk about attacks at the speed of light or attacks at network speed. And it's this idea that there's this magic that's going to happen, and in a couple seconds, the whole world will explode. My own research has shown that many times it's taking days, weeks, even months from when an adversary first gets into a target to when they have their effect. So if at any point during that time, generally it's a couple weeks to a month, you're able to interrupt their activities, you win and they lose. So that gives time for, if the private sector entity hasn't dealt with it, within the first week or whatever it is, the government could step in and say, hey, look, you guys have a problem. You need to deal with this before they accomplish their mission. So I think there can be ways to have the government help without having, say, government security equipment inside private sector organizations.
Yeah, I think it's careful. We need to be careful to say should the DoD defend these American companies versus should they secure them and monitor them actively to see if they're under attack. I think if the DoD saw an active attack on a private sector U.S. entity by a foreign nation state backer and had the ability to, they might stop it. But I do think it is a fair question to say, is it the responsibility of the DoD to respond on behalf of that private entity because of that, right? So if a warfighter was to show up and bomb a U.S. refinery, the DoD may defend that in the physical world and maybe should potentially do that in the virtual world as well. But I think it's careful. We need to be careful not to take the responsibility off these private entities to secure and monitor their own infrastructures as well.
And the strategy also provides for DoD's role in protecting critical U.S. interests of significant consequence, which would include loss of life and significant damage to property, although your bomber
It says that, but I don't really know what they mean by that, which is part of why I was wanting to see what y'all thought. I had one more and I forgot what it was. Most of what we talk about is others stealing information. According to press reports, the Iranians actually destroyed computers with Aramco that had some consequence for the Saudi oil production. Do y'all regard it as inevitable that at some point it won't just be stealing information, but there will be destruction of data or hardware, that there is inevitable escalation to these things with potentially more serious consequences on loss of life and so forth?
Sir, that's an excellent question. I do see that. Also, not just wholesale destruction, it could be subtle corruption such that we can't trust what we're dealing with, which in some ways I'd be more worried about because at least if it's destroyed, I know, okay, I have to restore from backups and such. But even the restoration part, there was a great talk recently by a young lady who was involved in the incident response at Saudi Aramco. They basically went to Japan, South Korea, and bought every laptop, hard drive, computer that they could find in order to bring that refinery back. That's not something you're going to be able to do over and over again.
I think over time, anything can happen, and definitely capabilities do exist to conduct destructive attacks. But I think we should be careful in expecting motivations of actors in cyberspace to be fundamentally different from actors outside of cyberspace. And there are significant reasons why adversaries would not want to conduct an out-of-the-blue attack. Where I think it is of more concern potentially is inside a warfighting scenario where the United States is engaged overseas. It would be certainly an asymmetric option open to the adversary that was not available in years past to make an attack on the US homeland. And understanding that dynamic, I think, is going to be important and probably more likely to be something that the DoD should consider than a bolt from the blue attack. As DNI Clapper, I think, said recently, data manipulation may be a more likely and worrying scenario than something destructive like Saudi Aramco.
Okay, I'm sorry, did you have something you wanted to add?
I was just going to mention that data manipulation is certainly being demonstrated in the academic sector. There are several studies that show that manipulating small bits of information in, for example, GPS signals can cause unexpected reactions when the data is processed within the computer and the GPS receiver, and it's something that DoD will have to take very seriously.
It's a great point, and I guess kind of related to that, what I think may be more likely is the sort of plausible deniability. It's not really us, you know, this is just happening on its own. We're seeing that in warfare in general. To cause confusion and uncertainty, to slow the response. And I agree, if it's active warfare, then all holes are barred. But even to put pressure on our economy, doing things with the banking system that you can't quite figure out why it's slowing down, et cetera, is a huge challenge. We could talk much of the day about the challenges we face. I really appreciate y'all being here, and I think you have helped set up a number of the issues that we will address to the Deputy Secretary and Admiral Rogers tomorrow. And so thank you for your testimony. With that, the hearing stands adjourned.